Welcome, everyone, to the latest installment of EMS Focus, a collaborative federal webinar series. My name is Noah Smith. I'm a project manager at the Office of Emergency Medical Services here at NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And together with our federal partners, NHTSA's Office of EMS is focused on advancing a national vision for EMS that focuses on improving patient care across the country. And the projects we undertake and the resulting resources for the community help plan for system improvements, help to measure the health of EMS systems nationwide, and help to deliver the data that EMS leaders need to advance their individual systems. Another role of the Office of EMS is to educate the EMS community on new innovations, new processes, advances in technology that in the end help provide better care and more efficient patient care to our communities who we serve. And this free webinar series hosted by the Office of EMS is a unique opportunity for federal EMS agencies to share information with the EMS community in a manner that is more personal and less time-consuming and less costly, obviously, than attending conferences, but really offers the community real opportunities to interact with and ask questions in a way that a newsletter, or an email really just doesn't allow for. EMS Focus conducts webinars every other month on issues that are important for the EMS community and provides you with timely information on what federal agencies are doing about those issues. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived on ems.gov for future viewing and listening. More information and to view all of the previous EMS Focus webinars, head to our website, www.ems.gov, click on News and Events and EMS Focus. So today I am really excited because we have an expert panel of local, state, and federal EMS leaders and colleagues who have helped advance pre-hospital care through the development and implementation of evidence-based guidelines and protocols. And of course, after years, decades of practicing medicine largely based on theory and anecdotal evidence, EMS is embracing a new phase and a new future, one in which treatment decisions are based on research and data more than ever before. Evidence-based guidelines, which are developed through a specific, validated, and frankly time-consuming process, play a critical role in improving patient care and outcomes. But like any other change and any other improvement, implementing these guidelines and incorporating them into the pre-hospital practice is not always as simple as it may seem. And so today's panel is here to share their experiences and answer questions from you so that your agencies can learn from their stories and provide evidence-based, patient-centered care. This discussion will address how data collection, research, and evidence-based guidelines are changing EMS and improving patient care across the country. We're going to share ideas for how to educate providers about new protocols, how to overcome resistance to accepting evidence-based guidelines, and the potential for more guidelines to be implemented at the state and national levels as well. And as always, during these EMS-focused presentations, attendees are encouraged to submit questions using the questions box on the webinar platform at any point in the discussion. We're going to address those questions during the Q&A session at the very end of our presentation. And as you'll also see throughout the presentation, some of the slides are a little detailed. We don't need you to be taking notes throughout. If you click on the Materials tab, you'll be able to download a PDF of today's slides right there on your webinar platform. And they'll also be available on ems.gov. Today's panel is comprised of EMS experts who have a passion for improving patient care through the use of data and evidence-based guidelines. Dr. Beth Edgerton is the Director of the Division of Child, Adolescent, and Family Health at the Maternal Child Health Bureau of the Health Resources and Services Administration, part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And that bureau houses the EMS for Children program and injury prevention programs, which is also where she previously served as branch chief. And as an academician and program administrator, Dr. Edgerton has worked in the fields of pediatric EMS, injury prevention, and clinical preventive services throughout her career. She is a previous EMSC Targeted Issues grantee and currently represents HRSA on the Federal Interagency Committee on EMS. Dr. Chris Saunders is in his 13th year as Associate Medical Director of the Houston Fire Department. He completed medical school at Baylor College of Medicine, his emergency residency at the University of Rochester in New York, and an EMS fellowship with Baylor and the Houston Fire Department. He is board certified both in emergency medicine and emergency medical services. And Dr. Matt Scholl is an emergency physician and associate professor at Maine Medical Center in Portland, Maine, and also at Tufts Medical School. He trained at Boston Medical Center and completed his EMS fellowship with Boston EMS. He's the state EMS medical director for Maine and the medical director of the Portland, Maine Fire Department. He's currently working on 2 federal grants exploring the development, dissemination, and implementation of evidence-based guidelines for EMS, entitled the Statewide Implementation of Pre-Hospital Care Guidelines, and also the Pegasus Project, which he's going to talk about later on today. And I'm Noah Smith again. I'll serve as your moderator. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Beth Edgerton from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HRSA's EMSC program, Division of Child, Adolescent, and Family Health. Beth.
Great. Thank you, Noah. A mouthful there. We're very excited to have you all on our webinar today and really hope that today's webinar will explain why evidence-based practice is so important, how it helps improve patient care and outcomes, and how and why state and local EMS systems should consider the adoption of evidence-based approach to their care. Next slide. Again, I'd like to present a little bit of history to where we are today. As Noah alluded, it's been a long journey, but I think we're at a crossroads that really shows how far the field is being advanced. If we look back, NHTSA's Office of EMS and HRSA's EMS for Children's program have been working with EMS stakeholders since 2008 to create and test a model to develop and implement evidence-based guidelines, which would promote care based on best current scientific knowledge. The challenge to develop standard evidence-based pre-hospital protocols came from the Institute of Medicine's 2006 Future of Emergency Care series, which included the seminal Emergency Medical Services at the Crossroads report. The first evidence-based guideline stakeholder meeting then followed in 2008, convened by NHTSA and co-sponsored by FICOMS, the Federal Interagency Committee on EMS, and the National EMS Advisory Council, also known as NEMSAC. Those who attended helped inform the draft model process to shepherd development, implementation, and evaluation of EMS guidelines that is built on what NHTSA describes an objective and transparent process for appraising the quality of clinical evidence. That same year, our EMSC program with Children's National Resource Center beta tested the process to develop a guideline for managing pediatric seizures. That was to see, could we really put this model to test? Again, evidence-based guidelines are systematically developed statements to assist the practitioner to patient decisions about appropriate care for specific clinical circumstances. They help translate research into practice. Providers operate under the delegated practice of a physician and medical director. They help summarize available evidence on broad clinical topics, and show improved effectiveness and safety of care, can provide clinicians with relevant and reliable summaries of evidence, address the situation of treatment uncertainties, can help maximize the use of healthcare resources, and enhance shared decision-making between patients and physicians. So again, it's really a process from taking the research and taking it to the field. And again, more of these background documents are available on NHTSA's website that Noah alluded to. Next slide, please. So what we're happy to present to you today is an investment we made in our research grants called our Targeted Issue Grants that's supported by EMS for Children. We'll be sharing with you the Pediatric Evidence-Based Guidelines Assessment of EMS System Utilization in States, also known as Pegasus, and Dr. Manish Shah is the director of this project. What's exciting about this project is that it takes evidence-based guidelines, uses an approach of grade, which will be described by our speakers today, to take it from the research point of view to the practical application and what makes sense in the field. The exciting part is its implementation at the state level, and Dr. Scholl will be discussing that to really understand how we take this to scale. Again, the Pegasus project brought together a multidisciplinary group to develop 4 guidelines. You'll hear about that: the airway management, allergic reaction shock, and spine care. And then implemented those first in the Houston Fire Department, which we'll hear about, and then took it statewide into several northeastern New England states in the summer of 2015. That include, obviously, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And again, it gives us almost our first population level implementation and data to look at the effectiveness and outcomes of using this model. So again, I'll pass this on to Dr. Saunders to talk about the Houston Fire Department experience and pass it on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so in order for my side, was asked to talk about the implementation of the guidelines in the Houston Fire Department. Next slide. This slide shows some basic information about the Houston Fire Department to give you an idea of the kind of change we're making. We're the single 911 response agency for the city with an over 2.1 million population. Last year we had over 277,000 EMS runs. And we're a dual-tiered system, so some of the changes that were made affected only ALS and some affected both ALS and BLS. And for training purposes, we have over 3,800 people, 700 of which are ALS and 3,100 are BLS. Next slide. And so in terms of our current status of the patient care protocols, our protocol books are available online at hfdmd.org if you'd like to take a look at them. But we have over 58 separate protocols that cover cardiac arrest, medical emergencies, and trauma emergencies. Next slide. And they are updated every other year. And to be honest, in the department, we have, with the number of protocols we have, we're unable to do a true evidence-based guideline update of our protocols every year. And so they're based sort of on standard of care, expert opinion, comparison of us to other agencies at medical director conferences we go to. And we were approached by Dr. Shaw and his colleagues, and we were happy to have their input and assistance, because we've always known that it's important to have the set of evidence-based guidelines, but we didn't have the time and the personnel to honestly go through it appropriately like we should have. Next slide. And so they approached us, and we were eager to review and implement the changes that they made. And as the issues that were picked for the first targeted issues grant by Dr. Shaw and his colleagues covered the respiratory protocols that we have, which were asthma, bronchiolitis, and our croup guidelines. And these were chosen by the multidisciplinary guideline development committee that he had put together. Next slide. And this committee met over 6 months and had several meetings and conference calls and followed the grade process as published with the National Pre-Hospital Evidence-Based Guidelines Model process. And I think of importance in this committee, he also included pre-hospital personnel that were going to be the providers in the field that were utilizing these guidelines. Next slide. The committee chose the topics based upon the prevalence of those diseases in the community and with the recognition that there was variation in practice amongst EMS sites, that they were resource-intensive conditions that carried high morbidity risk, and that EMS could provide therapeutic options in the field for those conditions, and that there was enough existing evidence for us to formulate a guideline. Next slide. And for the second Children Targeted Issues Grant, Dr. Shaw picked out airway management, and his colleagues picked out airway management, allergic reaction shock, and spinal care, which were conditions the group felt had met the criteria but were just not selected the first time around. And next slide. The last 2 protocol changes we made were regarding seizure care and pre-hospital analgesia, and these were published evidence-based guidelines that he and other colleagues were involved in the publication of. So we had all these changes to make, and I have 2 slides if you go to the next slide for allergic reaction. I'm not going to go through all of the changes, but to give you an example of 2 conditions for which we made the change. On allergic reaction, we made the decision with the evidence-based guideline that ALS should give the epinephrine for anaphylaxis as soon as possible. And when an auto-injector was present on site, because we have BLS crews and first responder engines that carry those, that the ALS would be instructed to utilize the auto-injector for the earliest possible administration of the epinephrine. We had some clarification weight-based for the use of the EpiPen Junior and EpiPen, and that we had a much more aggressive fluid resuscitation protocol for anaphylactic shock, and then proceeding to dopamine if 3 fluid boluses was not effective. We also had methylprednisolone IV as treatment in there, and then that was removed as it wasn't supported by the evidence process review. And then the next slide for seizures shows the changes we made there. We dictated that midazolam, which is our benzodiazepine for seizure treatment, would be given intramuscular or intranasally in order to speed up the administration of that drug in patients who are having seizures. The intramuscular intranasal dose was also doubled to a more therapeutic dosing. We removed from our protocol the administration of rectal midazolam, which won us a lot of favor in the department, and just clarified that an IO can be placed after first treatment in order for subsequent treatments after that. Next slide for education. Education in a large fire department with 3,800 people and next to nothing budget is a very challenging prospect. We were able, one of the strategies we did was incorporate this training with our every other year protocol update. And so there were some other protocols being updated, and we were able to get the funding available to bring in all of our ALS providers in person for a 2-hour training session where we had the personnel from Texas Children's and ourselves give the presentation about why we were making these changes, what the changes were, what the evidence shows, and physiologically why these treatments were either indicated or not indicated in the case of steroids with allergic reaction, for instance. They also had a mandatory online training session which covered the same topics. For our BLS providers, unfortunately, due to the number, we were not able to afford having them all get overtime for training, and they were left just with the online training module. That was at the end of 2014, and we've continued training on these topics, both with online training, and we have a program that we are engaged with Texas Children's called the PD Steps program, which is a mannequin PD simulation-based training that we send crews in their standard response mode, so an ALS, BLS, and first responder engine for a full-day training at the Pediatric Simulation Center, and these protocols are reviewed and practiced on there. Next, for monitoring, this is one area where I'm not terribly proud of our in-house or fire department-based activities. Our actions here tend to be more reactive than proactive in terms of monitoring adherence to the guidelines. We do have EMS supervisors and medical directors which provide quality assurance and quality improvement, and review, unfortunately, tends to be more of a reactive to concerns and complaints rather than proactive. And so this is where our partnership with Dr. Shaw and his colleagues and amongst this thing and the research they're doing to review the changes has been of utmost importance to provide some external validation of our actions. And so the next slide, in terms of monitoring, ongoing research is looking at pre- and post-implementation, and every change that we made has a scorecard of metrics has been developed in order to analyze the change for that evidence-based guideline. And the next slide shows an example of the scorecard. So the allergic reaction scorecard has a whole bunch of things. I know it's hard to read, but it's basically looking at the number of patients that receive epinephrine, looking at the time frame, how quickly did they get it upon arrival of EMS, location of the injection, appropriate weight-based dosing if they're not using the auto-injector, and outcome purposes looking at the percent of patients that require advanced airway management, anything more than just supplemental oxygen. And the next slide shows this scorecard for seizure, and it's similar in that looking at time frames of administration, looking at how often our guys are actually using the intranasal or intramuscular administration route as opposed to delaying and starting an IV. Also looking at outcomes in terms of respiratory distress or failure after administration of drugs. So the next slide, in terms of the lessons learned, one that our particular position with our funding and staffing challenges, it's very important to be able to collaborate with partners, usually academically affiliated partners, but outside partners that can assist us in ensuring that we are giving appropriate treatment. And that training is a consistent challenge, and looking for new and creative ways to train and obtain compliance with the field personnel is always a challenge. And we're assessing new ways to assess adherence because we don't have the personnel to do that manually anymore, and we're working on an integration with ImageTrend, who's our EPCR provider, to run some of the basic reports that we're looking at here on the metrics. And the last slide, I think it's important to realize, every agency is different, and what is the best method to go about making change in your agency? Is it best to just be a top-down mandate that is given to the field to follow, or is it best to build some interest, from the ground up? So in this particular case, multiple paramedics were included in the evidence-based guideline committee, and their experience there fed out to the field, and this was something that was anticipated and looked forward to by a majority of our field personnel, certainly at the ALS level, which is where most of the changes were made. But, depending upon what your agency is, who is the change maker in the agency? Is it a medical director? Some agencies don't have strong medical directors, and it might be an EMS director or a fire chief. We even had some discussions with the union, which played a strong role in supporting medical director activities over the past times. So there weren't many financial repercussions of implementing these recommendations. They used medicines that we already had. Our only challenge was obtaining oral dexamethasone, but that was a relatively small line item in the budget. I spoke before we implemented these changes when our general every other year protocol change was going on. We were concerned that implementing some smaller changes might be overlooked, and then the department was also less likely to fund overtime for in-person training unless we had a significant amount of changes. And so luckily that's how it happened. And so that's really all I have for now until we get around to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saunders. We really appreciate it. An incredible local perspective. And now we're going to hand it over to Dr. Matt Scholl from the state of Maine for a statewide implementation perspective. Dr. Scholl.
Thank you, Noah. My name is Matthew Scholl, and as mentioned by Dr. Edgerton, Maine is one of the states involved in Pegasus from an implementation standpoint as one of the New England states. We built off the experience of Chris and Dr. Shaw and others in Houston and implemented shortly thereafter. Next slide shows some of the topics I hope to discuss today, which includes the idea of how to gain buy-in for statewide evidence-based guidelines, the challenge of education at the state level, which I think we have shared some of the experiences of Dr. Sauter and others in Houston, the power of data collection, the challenges and benefits of this, and then finally some of the future of EBGs, certainly at our state level, our regional level, and also nationwide. Next slide. First, it's important to understand a little bit about Maine EMS and to understand the particulars of Maine EMS. Maine EMS is made up of 6 EMS regions, and in the early 1980s, each of these regions published their own EMS protocols that were vetted locally and finalized at the discretion of a regional medical director. For each regional medical director, had a very different time frame for updating their protocols, a process for the revision of these protocols, and then had very different values and preferences regarding medical care. In the mid to late 1980s, Maine EMS initiated a process under what's called the Medical Direction and Practice Board, or the MDPB, to unify the EMS guidelines in the state. This program was initiated with the understanding that the differences in care between populations is less than one would think, and that the medical principles and practices are much more similar than initially envisioned between rural and urban areas. What does change, though, is the application of the medical principles based on the presence or absence of medical resources. And since that time, Maine has published statewide EMS protocols, which include both ALS and BLS practices. The next slide demonstrates what's happening nationally regarding ALS protocols, at least as of 2013. This comes from a paper from Doug Koopas and all, published in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care, demonstrating the presence or absence of state-based protocols and what type of state-based protocols exist. I'll describe those different types between mandatory A or B or C, etc., in a few slides. Maine is one of 7 states that has what are called mandatory A protocols for BLS providers. And then the next slide demonstrates that Maine is one of 8 states with mandatory A protocols for ALS providers. The next slide describes what these different types of protocols are. When Dr. Koopas and his colleagues, of which I was one of them, were looking at various statewide protocols, we realized that there were different ways that states behaved around their protocols, and we needed to categorize them in different ways. For example, we defined statewide protocols that must be used by all EMS providers within a state as mandatory A, while mandatory B are statewide protocols that must be used by all EMS providers within a state, but there's a process for services to petition the state to alter some of those protocols. Mandatory C is similar in that there's a process for services to petition the state to develop and use their own entire protocol set. And then additionally, there are model protocols which were published by a state and offered for use but not mandatory. Some states have regional protocols, such as that existed in Maine before the 1980s and 90s. And then finally, some states endorse local protocols with multiple states just using that model. The next slide was intended to transition us and consider the implementation of these implementation of these evidence-based protocols occurring between both Houston and New England, and the Pegasus project, which stands for the Pediatric Evidence-Based Guidelines Assessment of System-Wide Utilization in States. The next slide begins to discuss the goals of Pegasus, which were first and foremost to add to the literature base and develop 4 evidence-based guidelines for pediatric emergencies using the GRADE methodology. The second goal of Pegasus was to disseminate these protocols along with the 2 previously existing EBGs, namely pain control and respiratory distress. Many states had already implemented the Seizure evidence-based guideline, and so that was not included in this list. And we wanted to disseminate these not only to a specific city, i.e. Houston, but we wanted to implement these across a large population base. And we chose New England in part because of our proximity to New England, our network of medical directors and state EMS directors in New England, and the presence of state-based protocols in many of the New England states. Once these were disseminated, we wanted to implement them, or not only share them, but actually place them in practice. And finally, one of the very important and very exciting pieces of Pegasus was to measure the impact of these EBGs. There's been a lot of discussion of the merits of EBGs. We wanted to start measuring the impact of EBGs on a large population base. The next slide discusses the status or where the project currently is. As Dr. Sauder alluded to or discussed, the Pegasus Guidelines Group developed guidelines for the EMS management of pediatric shock, spine management, airway management, and anaphylaxis. We hope that these will be published in a peer-reviewed journal in late 2016 or early 2017 for others to use as well. These were disseminated in Houston first in an effort to review them, to look at impact, to get an idea of any necessary changes, and then were implemented in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And as mentioned earlier, pain management and respiratory distress were added to the 4 evidence-based guidelines created by the Pegasus Group. These were implemented in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts to date, with pending implementation in Rhode Island, and they're established as a model practice in Connecticut. The next slide discusses some of the barriers and enablers to implementation. And this work comes not only from our experience in Pegasus, but also is informed through the NHTSA-funded NSEMSO project called Implementation of a Statewide EMS Evidence-Based Guideline Project that's led by Dr. Peter Talak from Utah, myself, and Rachel Alter from NSEMSO. We found through this Pegasus project that the presence of statewide protocols acts as a significant enabler to the dissemination and implementation of evidence-based guidelines. And that's true for Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. States that have a process and a schedule for regularly revising these protocols were able to implement these protocols in a very timely fashion. That included Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Another enabler that we have discovered not only through this project but through the statewide implementation project is that the presence of a local champion that has political positioning to advocate for the implementation of evidence-based guideline acts as a significant barrier. And this, in looking across the literature, appears to be a significant enabler for multiple different implementation projects, be them protocols or evidence-based guidelines or even AHA work. This is a very important a very important enabler that we're learning about through these 2 projects. And then one of the features that acted as an enabler in the Pegasus project, but actually was a little bit more challenging in the implementation of a statewide evidence-based guideline, was the presence of a learning management system. What I can sum up is that if that learning management system is available and has been tested, it ends up being a powerful tool. But if it is a new project, program for a specific project, there's commonly a learning curve to how to use that product, and also a learning curve on its implementation and access for EMS providers. As far as barriers, the largest barrier that we have encountered in the Pegasus project is when states do not have pre-existing statewide protocols. And our example here is Connecticut, which has local or in some cases regional protocols, and currently is looking to create statewide protocols. It was harder to either disseminate or implement the Pegasus guidelines in Connecticut, in part because of their current lack of statewide protocols. However, one of the major successes that Connecticut has experienced is the publication of these in a model form and a widespread endorsement of these from their regional and local medical directors. States that don't have an empowered local champion have had a harder time implementing these. And then finally, states without a widespread education process, be it electronically or in person or otherwise, have had a difficulty in disseminating and implementing these. The next slide discusses some of the challenges that we have learned through the 2 projects to implementation, and then some of the strategies that we've invoked to overcome those challenges. Challenge number 1 is something that Dr. Suter alluded to, which is the idea of ownership in the development of the protocol. And we have found through both projects that when a state or when a locality has ownership in the development process, the protocol is much more easily implemented. Now, that ownership might be in the early phases, as Dr. Sauter discussed, and in the specific development and going through the grade process, but it may also take place after the grade process is completed, as a state or locality vets the established guideline and looks at the guideline under the guise of local values and preferences. Challenge number 2 is a challenge that I think it doesn't exist just for the implementation or dissemination of evidence-based guidelines, but includes the idea of messaging and sharing very nuanced medical protocols to a vast number of providers of various skills and backgrounds over a large geographic area. Some of the specifics of Maine, we have approximately 6,000 licensed providers, of which approximately 1,500 are advanced EMTs, approximately 1,500 are paramedics, and approximately 3,000 are EMTs. We have found that it is at times very difficult to share nuanced messages to that large number of providers over a large geographic area. And we've tried to approach this by dialoguing in multiple different venues and using multiple different media platforms, including podcasts, a state-based learning management system, eLearns. We also try to reinforce and have tried to reinforce the lessons of a specific guideline through QI projects and ongoing continuing education, as well as finding remote points from the implementation to circle back and discuss the protocol. Finally, along with the technologically laden mechanisms to educate, we've also attempted to be as present as possible in various state venues and discuss in person some of these protocols. The next challenge includes, or the next slide discusses the third challenge, which is an interesting piece of GRADE, and one reason why I have come to really appreciate GRADE. GRADE offers both strong and weak recommendations, with strong recommendations being those in which the benefit significantly outweighs the risks and therefore should be implemented. Weak recommendations, however, are those in which the benefits and risk rest closer to each other, and in these cases, the local implementation group must decide if these weak recommendations should be implemented based on local values and preferences. Dr. Sauder mentioned Decadron and Croup, which was one of the recommendations that came out of the Pegasus project. The strong recommendation was to utilize a steroid. The weak recommendation was to utilize Decadron. We opted in Maine, for instance, to hold on implementing Decadron because of the presence of other steroids that were already on the formulary and a feeling that it would be easier to implement this using alternate steroids instead of Decadron. Now, the next slide transitions us to discuss quality improvement in statewide data. And as mentioned prior, one of the Pegasus Project's goals is to discover the value of evidence-based guidelines at the state level and really at the population level, combining the populations of all 6 New England states by using each of the state's participatory databases and collecting information both pre- and post-implementation of the guidelines. As it turns out, most of the New England states use a common data program, and each state's data manager has been working to combine everyone's data into a common data cube. Now, beyond the use of the statewide data here, we in Maine have had numerous occasions in which it has been beneficial to reach into our own practice and learn more about what we do, and then using this information to craft our current or upcoming protocols. One example of this included a discussion and process we went through in 2011, in which we were wrestling with advanced airway management in the form of intubation for our AEMT scope of practice. Some background here is important in that we were having a significant difficulty in both maintaining the skill set at the AEMT level, as well as teaching the skill set with decreased opportunities for initial and ongoing training. We had discussed the option of adopting the national scope of practice for the AEMT the AEMT scope, and after reviewing years of Maine EMS experience through our database, we learned that the number of cases in which the AEMT was the highest scope of practice and intubation occurred was actually tremendously low, less than a dozen times over a period of 3 years. And that we felt in those instances there were alternate options for airway management that could have been just as successful as intubation. Other examples include reviewing our experience in pressor use prior to changing our pressor of choice in 2013 from dopamine to norepinephrine, as well as considering the impact of removing steroids from the formulary in the process of going through the Pegasus implementation. One word of caution I would add, however, is that the ability to make informed decisions based on statewide data is in part predicated on the purity of the data, and in some cases the data is not mature enough to glean meaningful information, at least not on a population basis without digging very deeply into the narrative. In the above examples that I mentioned, however, the questions that we asked were direct enough and the existing data rich enough that we're able to answer the questions posed. The next slide discusses the future and what will come in the future from evidence-based guidelines. I think Dr. Edgerton really nicely summarized some of the benefits of evidence-based guidelines, and that's led us to this point that we exist at right now. It's difficult to know exactly what the future holds, but personally, my impression is that EMS evidence-based guidelines will become increasingly prevalent in our everyday practice, and I think that will happen for the following reasons. Number one, where there exists good evidence that a certain therapy is beneficial with little to no risks to the patient or provider and can be easily implemented in a timely and financially responsible means, these therapies really should be perpetuated across the entire EMS system, and evidence-based guidelines give us an opportunity to identify such therapies. I've also found personally in my work with Maine EMS in developing EMS protocols or guidelines, the process of extracting, reviewing, digesting, and compiling the medical literature on any given topic is fairly arduous in time. It requires a significant amount of time. When an individual or group performs such a detailed literature review on a medical topic and summarizes it, it makes sense for others to take advantage of that workload and to work share using their efforts to help inform their local EMS guidelines. I also believe that the more similar EMS systems are, the easier it is to discover the impact of EMS at the population level. And the discovering the value of EMS is going to be an important step for us in the future as we're looking at our place in the greater healthcare system. And then finally, this idea of evidence-based guidelines, the implementation, dissemination of evidence-based guidelines is a big priority at the national level with numerous state, national, and regional stakeholders sharing the same vision. And I think for those four reasons, we'll see more evidence-based guidelines published in the future and then implemented in the future. The next slide discusses one example of this. Locally, Maine is collaborating with 5 other New England states on a project to better align our EMS protocols. I mentioned earlier that 5 of the New England states have statewide protocols of some variety, and the 6th is currently has model guidelines but hopes to establish statewide protocols in the very near future. We have discussed since 2012 the prospect of having uniform protocols, and we believe that the benefits are numerous, including the ability to increase operational efficiencies in daily cross-state patient care, but also in the face of disasters when resources are shared across state lines. The idea of having commonality in protocols could suit operational needs. We also believe that by sharing the workload, we decrease in the individual states' work needs while reviewing and updating protocols. We also believe that this offers us a mechanism to share best practices, not only in patient care, but in implementation and dissemination, including educational products when they're developed, can be shared across states. And then finally, one of the very exciting things is that we are offered a better quality improvement efforts when we consider a larger population than the smaller populations in any given state. For instance, when I think about cardiac arrest in Maine, I consider a population of 1.3 million people with approximately 1,000 to 1,500 cardiac arrests per year. The New England experience offers a much larger population to learn at, with greater than 14 million individuals, and we expect closer to 10,000 to 15,000 cardiac arrests. We also recognize that while there are very large and very important groups like the ROC and the PCARNs of the world that are really looking at novel EMS practice and putting out tremendously important research, those are really different than what we're talking about. Those are quite controlled and heavily resourced paradigms, really offering an in vitro experience while the New England Protocol Project offers a large population that's more of an in vivo or a in live time experience with rich and nuanced populations between urban, suburban, rural, frontier, and a wide variety of providers caring for those populations. And we believe this experience will offer fruitful lessons for the states involved as well as the national experience. And with that, I'll transition to the next slide, which is questions, and turn it back over to Noah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scholl. Incredible perspective and incredible information. We really appreciate you and your colleague, Dr. Saunders and Dr. Edgerton, taking the time to share with us today. We are fortunate to have about 10 or 15 minutes left in our webinar to answer some questions from our audience members. And just first, a quick housekeeping note. That we've noted from a few of you in the audience that we may have erroneously put up an incorrect link to the Houston Fire Department's website to download their guidelines. Looks like we may have been missing one letter. So the correct website to download Houston Fire Department's protocols is hfdmd.org. And that stands for Houston Fire Department Medical Director.org. HFDMD.org. Thank you very much to everyone. And, really, Dr. Scholl, you could not have summed up the potential for the future of evidence-based guidelines and evidence-based medicine in our profession any better. It was really just a very nicely packaged, and it falls so neatly into some of the priorities that we have here at the federal government and from the NHTSA Office of EMS and from HRSA's EMSC and injury prevention programs. And that is to make sure that we're putting the right information in the hands of people who can make a difference across the country. And when we know that something works, when we know that there's good evidence to show that we can save lives if we're doing things in a particular way, it's our responsibility really to push that out to states and to local EMS agencies so they can make those important changes locally and in a statewide manner. And one of our long-term goals, of course, is to make sure that there is high-quality emergency medical services across the country, so that if you are being taken care of in Texas or in Maine, you're receiving the same level of high-quality service and that is backed by the same level of high-quality evidence. So thank you to all three of our participants. I'm going to start with a few questions that came in from our audience members, and please keep asking questions. If we don't get to your questions today, we save all of them, and we will post answers to all the questions that we receive on our website, ems.gov. So please keep asking questions, even if we don't answer it today. So first, there were a lot of similarities between the two presentations from the local perspective and the state perspective, but one of them that really jumped out at me. In my off time, I'm also a volunteer EMT in the state of Maryland. And so I'm wondering, and perhaps we'll begin with Matt, how important it was to have provider involvement in the discussion early on for some of the protocol changes and evidence-based changes that you are planning to make in Houston Fire Department. So we'll start with Matt, and then we'll ask the same question to Chris for making statewide protocol changes. Matt?
Thank you, Noah.
Yeah, Matt is statewide.
I'm sorry about that. You're absolutely right. I got you too confused. Chris, we're going to start with Chris from the Houston Fire Department. Thanks very much.
Yeah. So I think it's very important to try to harness the energy that many providers have in order to, they want to improve their own care. They want to know why they're doing what they're doing, and they want to improve everything. So in Houston, unfortunately we have a tendency to force people to do things if they don't want to, and I think that would be a bad thing to do. But every department sort of knows who their strong, interested paramedics are. They're the ones that call and ask your medical director questions. We have a Facebook page, and they're the ones that are active on the Facebook page talking about new and exciting things. And so I think opening up the process to those people is very important. They begin to talk about it in the field and in the stations, spread awareness, so the change doesn't come abruptly to the field personnel, and they serve as sort of a leader at their level that they've brought off on it, and everyone else has a much easier time rather than just decisions being forced down from the top. So I think it's a great idea.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, please go ahead, man.
And no, I would echo what Chris mentioned, that I think it's essential not only in the implementation, having that voice present at the table is tremendously important. We've also found that having providers present at the table when these decisions are being made adds to the operational considerations. For instance, am a former EMT as well, but I practice most of my time clinically in a hospital and don't spend as much time in the field as I would like. And having someone who's very sensitive to the operational realities of a possible consideration becomes very important. And I would really suggest that for the Pegasus project, this was informed through Dr. Shaw's experience in the prior development of the respiratory distress protocol, and he, I think, very rightly recognized the importance of having a wide swath of stakeholders at the table to consider this. And so, for instance, in the Pegasus dialogue, there were pediatric emergency physicians, EMS providers, EMS medical directors, EMSC representatives, which acted as layperson representatives, and in the end, we also brought in a pharmacologist to consider some of the impacts from a pharmacologic standpoint. And it was really that rich group of folks who batted around ideas and came up with some of these changes. At our own state level, we realized the value and importance of inclusivity in the early 1990s and late 1980s when we were considering transitioning from regional protocols to statewide protocols. And that idea of inclusivity not only included having all physician regional medical directors present at the table, but also involved and has continued to involve having a mechanism for EMS providers to weigh in on either current protocols or offer upcoming potential for changes. And we try to be as inclusive as possible, not only holding open meetings, but also creating other venues for folks to offer their ideas through either email or conference calls or other ways. So it has become a very important piece, not only for implementation, but also for validation of the guidelines when they're being developed.
I think that's excellent. As a provider as well, I don't think I would expect me or my colleagues to know every new scientific paper that came out, every month on any variety of topics. But it would be very important for providers to have a voice in the implementation of the evidence-based guidelines and to provide real feedback about operational concerns and operational changes that can be made, which is really where the rubber meets the road with these guidelines. So I think that's just a very important point. Our next question comes from one of my very favorite people, who is Mr. Ken Nipper, who's very good to see is on the call today. And Ken has valiantly represented the interests of volunteers for many years. And his question is in regards to what sort of consideration is given to volunteer services when it comes to training issues in light of new evidence-based protocols. And so maybe we'll start with the statewide perspective from Matt. Working in New England states that have, of course, many volunteer services, can you speak to the sort of feedback that you've received from some of the volunteer services in Maine and other New England states and how you've been able to accommodate that sort of training and interaction?
Yeah, thanks, Noah. So our demographics are interesting. About 25% of our services are paid services, while 75% of our services are volunteer services. And interestingly, as far as the exposure to patients, about 75% of our calls are managed by those 25% of paid services, while 25% of our calls are managed by the 75% of volunteer services. We learned some time ago that there are at least three major barriers to education, and education is, I feel, a very important step in implementation. I think it becomes important to present the cause for change, the reasons for change. But those three barriers to education include geographic considerations, meaning a volunteer is located 3 hours away from the location that a training is ongoing. Another barrier is a temporal barrier, meaning that a volunteer very commonly has a daytime job and may not be able to be present at the time a training is ongoing. And then finally, there are financial barriers. And those include if you're traveling to some place for a training, it costs money to get there, stay there, and sometimes even take the training. And so we've tried to be very sensitive to all of those barriers when we're implementing and educating around protocols. And the ways we've done that are a multitude. They include hosting meetings at various locations at various times across the entire state. But another way that we've done this, and one way that I've been very excited about recently, is using new multimedia platforms to perform trainings. And so I've alluded to this in an earlier part of the talk and discussed the utilization of a state-based learning management system, which is a neat way to create a educational or implementation-based product and to leave it on a site that allows for it to be reviewed at any time in any location at no cost. Another thing we've tried to do as far as another educational or implementation venue is through podcasts. And we've posted podcasts in the state for the last couple of years that have been either a precursor to a larger education product or have been a standalone education product. And those are some of the ways that we're trying to approach the challenges of education across the state with a wide, vast population of providers of various different types.
Fantastic. That's excellent. And I know, Chris, in Houston, while you were worked for a fully paid service, you mentioned several barriers to training and education for your several thousand providers as well. So I don't think those challenges are unique to volunteers, certainly. Chris, do you want to speak a little bit to some of the challenges you faced in getting the funding and the opportunities to train your providers on these new protocols?
Sure. So in our fire-based service, the challenges relate primarily to motivational issues and financial issues. Many people join a fire department to be a firefighter, not an EMS provider, and that's their calling in life. And so, there's always a challenge as to motivating field personnel to understand the importance of it and see how it affects, their daily life at work, how their role of knowing what the appropriate treatment is can affect the patients that they encounter, and personalize it to them such that they take a personal interest in it. Financially, we fight to get dollars for education against people fighting to get dollars for fire hoses. And we don't always win, unfortunately. And so there is, that's a constant fight. We're also under the city budget, and city budgets go up and down. And so it's always a matter of trying to, it works best when you're able to say that this training is linked to this action, which we can then measure and show you was a productive use of your money, as opposed to a more nebulous approach.
Absolutely, and I think that's where some of the data really comes in when we talk about needing the data to show the impact of the guidelines that we're implementing, because, of course, the burden of proof is on the person who wants to change the status quo, and in this case, it's up to all of us to push for the right data being collected at the right time to really measure the impact of these evidence-based guidelines for the patients and the communities who we serve. There are so many more questions that are excellent, and I wish we had another hour to discuss them all, but unfortunately, it is 2 o'clock. I just wanted to get to one final comment and question and provide a little shout-out to our friends at the National Association of State EMS Officials. Someone asked about the many other protocols for which we don't have strong pre-hospital evidence for right now. And you could count the number of truly evidence-based guidelines that we have for our profession on 2 hands. And that's an excellent question and an excellent point. And I would direct folks to a project from the National Association of State EMS Officials called the National Model EMS Clinical Guidelines Project. the National Model EMS Clinical Guidelines Project, and this is out of the Medical Directors Council of the National Association of State EMS Officials. You can go to nasemso.org and download the document, and it is essentially a model set of protocols that states or localities can implement ready to go today. And it uses what they call the best available science, which in many cases is an evidence-based guideline, but in just as many cases, or if not more, it's not an evidence-based guideline, and that's important to recognize as well. And as we continue to invest in the development and implementation of EBGs, evidence-based guidelines, NASEMSO has agreed to continue to update that model guidelines document to reflect the new evidence that comes in. And so as we reach the end of our webinar today, I just have to thank our panelists and our participants so much again for 3 excellent presentations and for fielding some excellent questions from our audience. As I said, we're collecting all these questions, and so we'll be able to provide answers as well as a way to listen to and watch this webinar over and over again on ems.gov. This has been another installment of the EMS Focus webinar series. We thank you so much for your time and for your participation. Wish you a very happy day.